October 6, 1941. A rutted dirt road south of Mzensk, 30 kilometers from the city of Orel in western Russia, Lieutenant Hans Schäufler, commander of a Panzer IV in the 4th Panzer Division, watches through his periscope as a Soviet tank crests the ridgeline ahead. Its silhouette is unfamiliar. Not one of the obsolete 26 light tanks or wheeled BT-7s the Wehrmacht has been crushing for months. This machine is different. Lower profile, wider tracks, an angled hull that seems to deflect the weak autumn sunlight. Schäufler's gunner centers the crosshairs and fires. The 75mm shell screams downrange at over 1,000 feet per second. Impact. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But instead of penetration, instead of the satisfying plume of smoke and flame that marks a killing blow, the shell ricochets skyward with a metallic shriek that echoes across the battlefield. The Soviet tank doesn't slow, doesn't stop. It accelerates toward the German position, tracks churning mud, its own gun traversing with mechanical precision. In the 4 months since Operation Barbarossa began, German tank crews have grown accustomed to technical superiority. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs have outfought everything the Red Army fielded. But in this moment, watching that angular Soviet machine shrug off his best shot, Schäufler understands with sudden, terrible clarity that the rules have changed. The tank before him represents something the Wehrmacht's planners never anticipated, a convergence of metallurgy, geometry, and engineering that transforms 45mm of rolled steel into armor more effective than anything mounted on German vehicles. The Wehrmacht calls it the 34. Within weeks, German tank crews will call it something else, the impregnable monster, the tank that made impossible a word, whispered in field hospitals, and scrawled in desperate combat reports. This is the story of how sloped armor shattered German confidence and forced a revolution in tank design. Not through propaganda or exaggeration, but through the simple, undeniable physics of angled steel meeting high-velocity projectiles. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The largest military invasion in human history begins as 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces crash across the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's gamble to crush the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign, advances with the mechanized precision that conquered Poland in weeks and France in 40 days. The German High Command expects little resistance from Soviet armor. Intelligence reports describe a tank force composed primarily of obsolete designs, the 26 Infantry Support Tank, mounting a 37mm gun and protected by thin vertical armor. The BT series fast tanks, based on American designs from the 1930s, with armor so light that heavy machine guns can penetrate them at close range. These vehicles had performed adequately against the Finns in the Winter War of 1939–40, but against the Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine and superior crew training, they're little more than mobile coffins. German doctrine in 1941 centers on the Panzer III as the primary battle tank, armed with either a 37mm or 50mm gun and protected by 30 to 50mm of face-hardened steel. The Panzer III has proven capable of destroying any tank it encountered in Poland, France, or North Africa. The heavier Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support vehicle, carries a short-barreled 75mm gun optimized for firing high-explosive shells against fortifications. Against the thin-skinned Soviet tanks German intelligence knows about, these weapons are more than adequate. The Wehrmacht's anti-tank doctrine relies on a hierarchy of weapons. The standard Parquet 36, a 37mm towed gun, forms the backbone of infantry anti-tank defense. Every German infantry division deploys dozens of these weapons, and they've proven effective against Allied armor in every campaign so far. For heavier threats, the Army fields 50mm Pak 38 guns, and, in limited numbers, the fearsome 88mm Flak guns, originally designed for anti-aircraft work. But doctrine is built on assumptions, and the German Army's assumptions about Soviet armor are catastrophically outdated. The Soviets have been working on something the Germans don't know exists, a tank that combines firepower, armor, and mobility in ways that violate every principle of Western tank design. The 34. Development of the 34 began in 1937 under engineer Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin at the Kharkov locomotive factory. The Soviet Union had learned painful lessons from the Spanish Civil War, where their 26 tanks proved vulnerable to German anti-tank guns supporting Franco's forces. Soviet armor doctrine needed modernization, heavier protection, better mobility, a more powerful gun. Koshkin's breakthrough wasn't incremental improvement. It was revolutionary thinking about the fundamental relationship between armor, thickness, armor angle, and effective protection. Western tank designers in the 1930s prioritized vertical armor for manufacturing simplicity and internal space efficiency. Thicker plates meant heavier tanks, which meant slower speeds and more expensive production. The engineering trade-offs seemed straightforward. Protect the crew with thick vertical steel, accept the weight penalty, design the engine and suspension to move that weight. But Koshkin understood something the Germans wouldn't fully appreciate until it was too late. Armor effectiveness isn't just about thickness. It's about the angle at which a projectile strikes the plate. A shell hitting armor perpendicular to the surface must penetrate the full thickness of the steel, but strike that same plate at an angle, and the shell must travel through significantly more material to reach the interior. The geometry is elegant. A 60-degree slope transforms 45 mm of actual steel thickness into 90 mm of effective armor against projectiles following a horizontal trajectory. The 34's glacis, the front upper hull, uses 45 mm armor plate welded at a 60-degree angle from vertical. This creates effective armor protection equivalent to approximately 90 to 100 mm of vertical plate against direct frontal attack. The turret face mounts 60 mm of armor at a 30-degree slope, providing similar effective protection. The lower hull sides use 40 mm plates angled at 40 degrees. Every surface that might face enemy fire is sloped, creating a tank whose protection far exceeds what the armor's actual thickness suggests. This design philosophy carries consequences beyond protection. Sloped armor creates internal space problems. The steeply angled glacis reduces crew compartment volume. The ammunition storage becomes more difficult to arrange. Crew ergonomics suffer. But Koshkin accepted these compromises because he understood the fundamental battlefield calculus. A tank whose crew survives enemy fire can fight effectively despite cramped conditions. A tank whose crew dies because vertical armor failed to stop incoming rounds cannot fight at all, regardless of how comfortable the interior was. The 34's second revolutionary feature is its 76.2 mm F-34 gun. This weapon fires a 6.3 kilogram armor-piercing projectile at 612 meters per second. At 500 meters range, this shell can penetrate 61 millimeters of vertical armor plate. The Panzer III's frontal armor is 30 mm. The Panzer IV's is 50 mm. Both are vertically mounted. Against 34 fire, neither German tank can survive frontal engagement at normal combat ranges. The third innovation is mobility. The 34's V2-34 diesel engine produces 500 horsepower from 38.8 liters of displacement. This 12-cylinder engine was originally developed for Soviet aircraft, then adapted for tank use. Diesel offers crucial advantages over gasoline. Higher energy density means longer operational range. Lower volatility means reduced fire risk when penetrated. Better fuel economy at cruise speeds. The Germans, convinced that gasoline engines represent the pinnacle of tank propulsion, have standardized their armored force around high-octane petrol. This decision will prove costly. Wide tracks, 500 mm across, distribute the 34's 26-ton weight over large contact patches with the ground. Ground pressure averages 0.7 to 2 kilograms per square centimeter, significantly lower than contemporary German tanks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the mud and snow that characterize Russian terrain, This makes the difference between mobility and immobilization. The Christie suspension system, licensed from American designer J. Walter Christie, uses large road wheels and long travel coil springs. The ride is rough by Western standards, but the suspension can absorb punishment that would break conventional systems. By January 1940, the first 34 Model 1940 begins rolling off production lines at Kharkov. Full-scale production starts in June after extensive testing proves the design sound. The prototypes had been driven from Kharkov to Moscow and back, an 1,800-mile round trip through winter conditions, demonstrating mechanical reliability. They'd been tested against captured Finnish bunkers, proving the F-34 gun's effectiveness. They'd fired on test ranges until their barrels wore out, validating ammunition design. Stalin's bureaucracy approves mass production. The KHPZ factory at Kharkov, the Stalingrad tractor factory, and the Kirovsky factory in Leningrad all retool for 34 production. By June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa begins, the Soviet Union has deployed approximately 967 34 tanks, concentrated primarily in mechanized corps stationed in western military districts. Another 508 KV-1 heavy tanks, mounting similar sloped armor and even heavier protection, accompany them. German intelligence knows none of this. Not the production numbers, not the technical specifications, not the revolutionary armor design. The Red Army has maintained operational security around its newest weapons. When German troops cross the border on that June morning, they expect to face the obsolete tanks their intelligence reports describe. They are catastrophically wrong. June 23, 1941. One day after the invasion begins, elements of the German 6th Panzer Division advancing through Lithuania encounter a roadblock near Raseiniai. A single Soviet tank blocks the main road. The division's leading elements deploy Pak-36 anti-tank guns and open fire at ranges under 500 meters. Direct hits, but the shells bounce off with metallic clangs that sound like hammer strikes on an anvil. The Soviet tank doesn't retreat, it doesn't burn, it opens fire with its main gun, destroying 2 Pak-36 positions and killing their crews. German infantry attempt close assault with magnetic mines. The tank's machine guns cut them down. Panzer III's maneuver for flank shots. Their 50mm rounds strike home but fail to penetrate. This single KV-1 tank stalls the entire division's advance for 24 hours before finally running out of ammunition and being overrun. The Germans examine the wreckage with growing concern. The armor is thicker than anything they expected. More. Importantly, it's sloped at angles that transform relatively modest thickness into formidable protection. But the KV-1 is rare, heavy, expensive. The vehicle that will truly shock the Wehrmacht is smaller, faster, and being produced in numbers that will overwhelm German logistics. On that same day, June 23rd, German troops encounter 34 tanks for the first time near the Dvina River in Latvia. A German after-action report, filed by an officer whose name was lost to history but whose words survived in Wehrmacht archives, captures the moment. Half a dozen anti-tank guns fire shells at him, which sound like a drum roll, but he drives staunchly through our line like an impregnable prehistoric monster. The report continues with clinical precision that barely masks the writer's shock. It is remarkable that Lieutenant Stup's tank made hits on a 34, once at about 20 meters and 4 times at 50 meters, with Panzer granate 40 caliber 50mm, without any noticeable effect. This is impossible, according to German doctrine. The 50mm Pak-38 firing armor-piercing rounds should penetrate any medium tank's armor at those ranges. But the 34's sloped plates are doing something German gunners have never encountered. The shells are striking the angled surfaces and ricocheting away, their kinetic energy dissipated against steel they cannot penetrate. Across the vast front of Operation Barbarossa, similar encounters multiply. A 34 near the Ukrainian border takes direct hits from a battalion-sized contingent of German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns. Witnesses count more than 30 impacts. The tank's armor shows scarring and paint damage but no penetrations. It withdraws to Soviet lines a few hours later, battered but operational. German soldiers begin calling the 37mm Park 36 the Panzeranklopfgerät, the tank door knocker, because hitting a 34 with one doesn't destroy the tank. It just announces your presence and reveals your position, allowing the Soviet crew to target and eliminate the gun crew with their 76mm response. The Germans do destroy 34s, lots of them, but not through superior gunnery or better tactics. They destroy 34s through combined arms coordination, through artillery support, through Luftwaffe airstrikes, and most effectively, through exploiting Soviet command failures and fuel shortages that leave the new tanks immobilized or abandoned. Statistical analysis from 1941 shows the Red Army loses approximately 20,500 tanks during Operation Barbarossa's first 6 months. Of these, roughly 2,300 are 34s. But these losses don't come from German anti-tank guns systematically defeating 34 armor in direct combat. They come from operational collapse, from poorly trained crews who can't exploit their vehicles' technical advantages, from ammunition shortages that leave guns empty, from mechanical failures caused by rushed production and inadequate maintenance, from commanders who squander their armor in piecemeal counterattacks instead of concentrated operations. The Germans are winning through operational superiority, while confronting a technological revelation they're not prepared to counter. The summer and early autumn of 1941 pass in a blur of Wehrmacht victories. Kiev falls. Leningrad is besieged. Moscow seems within reach. But beneath the surface of these operational successes, a technological crisis is building. German tank crews are reporting encounters with Soviet armor they cannot reliably defeat. Not occasionally, not in isolated incidents. Consistently, across the entire front, field reports accumulate at Army Group Center headquarters. A Panzer III commander describes firing 6 rounds at a 34 from 200 meters, watching each shell ricochet without effect, then being destroyed by the Soviet tank's return fire. An infantry anti-tank team reports hitting a 34 11 times with their Pak 36, producing nothing but sparks and superficial damage before the tank destroyed their position. A Panzer IV gunner describes the psychological impact of watching his best shot, a 75mm high-explosive round that should devastate any medium tank, bounce off a 34's turret like a stone skipped across water. The reports use words that shouldn't appear in Wehrmacht combat assessments: frustration, helplessness, fear. German doctrine assumes technological superiority. The assumption isn't arrogance. It's based on validated performance against Polish, French, British, and Yugoslav armor. In every previous campaign, German tanks and anti-tank guns proved adequate or superior to enemy armor. But Soviet 34s and KV-1s are revealing that adequacy against obsolete opponents doesn't translate to adequacy against modern designs incorporating principles German engineers ignored. Then comes Mzensk, October 6, 1941. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army is driving toward Orel as part of Operation Typhoon, the final push toward Moscow. The 4th Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced armoured formations, advances along the main road from Orel toward Mzensk. They expect scattered resistance from demoralized Soviet units retreating eastward. They encounter the 4th Tank Brigade equipped with 34s, commanded by Colonel Mikhail Katukov, one of the Red Army's most capable tank officers. The Soviet tanks attack from concealed positions along wooded ridgelines, flanking the German advance. The engagement begins at ranges around 800 to 1,000 meters, 34 gunners, using their relatively crude sights but having the advantage of prepared positions and known ranges, open fire with F-34 guns. German tanks, caught in column formation on the road, suffer immediate casualties. A Panzer IV explodes as a 76mm round penetrates its side armor. A Panzer III loses its turret when an ammunition hit causes catastrophic detonation. The German tanks return fire, but they're shooting uphill at targets partially concealed by terrain and vegetation. Their rounds strike 34 armor and ricochet skyward. The angle of attack, combined with the 34's sloped plates, creates deflection that German gunners have never experienced in previous campaigns. They're not missing, they're hitting. The shells simply aren't penetrating. One German tank commander later describes his frustration. His gunner scored 6 consecutive hits on a single 34 at ranges where any previous enemy tank would have been destroyed. The 34 withdrew behind the ridgeline, waited for its crew to assess damage that proved superficial, then returned to continue the engagement. The 4th Panzer Division's advance stalls, not from being outfought in a traditional sense. The German crews are experienced, their tactics are sound, their courage is unquestioned. But they're fighting with weapons that cannot reliably damage their opponents while being hit by weapons that can destroy them with single shots. The psychological impact is devastating. Morale, the intangible factor that separates effective military units from formations on the verge of collapse, begins to crack. Guderian arrives at 4th Panzer Division headquarters on October 7th to assess the situation personally. What he finds shakes his confidence in German armor development. His division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, has been mauled by Soviet tanks his intelligence staff assured him were inferior. He writes in his memoir, Panzer Leader, published after the war. The 4th Panzer Division was attacked by Russian tanks to the south of Mzensk and went through some bad hours. This is German military understatement. When a general describes his division experiencing bad hours, the reality involves casualties, damaged equipment, and shaken confidence that will take weeks to restore. More importantly, Guderian recognizes that Mzensk represents something beyond a tactical reverse. It reveals a systemic problem. The Wehrmacht's tank force, which conquered most of Europe in 2 years, is technologically outmatched by Soviet medium armor. This isn't a problem that field commanders can solve through better tactics or improved training. This requires fundamental changes to German tank design, and those changes take months or years to implement. Time the Wehrmacht doesn't have. The encounters with 34s prompt responses throughout the German command structure. General Feldmarschall Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, commanding the 1st Panzer Army in the south, calls the 34 the finest tank in the world. This isn't praise offered lightly. Von Kleist commanded armor in Poland, France, and now Russia. He's evaluated the best tanks European industry produced. His assessment that a Soviet tank represents the pinnacle of current design acknowledges a reality German propaganda cannot admit. The Wehrmacht's technological superiority is a myth. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, later serving as Chief of Staff for various Panzer Corps, reports that German field commanders are experiencing what Soviet troops call tank terror. Not fear of tanks in general, which soldiers on all sides experience when facing armor without adequate anti-tank weapons, but specific terror directed at the 34. Von Mellenthin's assessment, published in his post-war memoir, states simply, "We had nothing comparable, no equivalent protection, no equivalent gun, no equivalent mobility. These aren't isolated opinions from junior officers easily dismissed as combat shock exaggeration. These are assessments from the Wehrmacht's most experienced armor commanders, men who built their reputations on evaluating enemy capabilities accurately and responding effectively. Their words carry weight precisely because they're not given to hyperbole." On November 20th, 1941, a special commission arrives at Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army headquarters. The Panzer Commission, led by Oberst Sebastian Fichtner, head of the Weapons Testing Office 6, includes Germany's senior tank development engineers, representatives from major manufacturers Daimler-Benz and MAN, and armament specialists tasked with understanding how Soviet tank design achieved superiority. German engineers thought impossible. The commission examines captured 34s. They measure armor thickness. They calculate slope angles. They inspect the F-34 gun's design. They test the diesel engine. They interview German tank crews about their combat experiences. And they reach conclusions that fundamentally challenge German armor development philosophy. Three features of the 34 particularly impress the Commission. First, the sloped glacis armor providing protection that exceeds anything German tanks mount, despite using relatively modest steel thickness. Second, the wide tracks and Christie suspension offering cross-country mobility superior to German vehicles, especially in mud and snow. Third, the long-barreled gun overhanging the hull front, a design feature German engineers avoided because it complicates maneuvering in forests and urban terrain, but provides superior armor penetration through increased muzzle velocity. The Commission's formal report to the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Office, acknowledges that the Wehrmacht faces a tank technologically superior to the Panzer III and Panzer IV. Frontline officers propose the obvious solution: copy the 34, manufacture it in German factories using German production standards and metallurgy, get superior tanks into frontline service within months rather than waiting years for entirely new designs. But German industry cannot replicate the 34 quickly. The diesel engine requires aluminum alloy blocks the German economy cannot produce in necessary quantities. The Soviets developed specialized aluminum casting techniques for aircraft engine production, then adapted them for the V-234. Germany's diesel engine production focuses on submarines and naval vessels. Converting automotive plants to produce large displacement diesel engines would disrupt existing production schedules for trucks and other vehicles the Wehrmacht desperately needs. The sloped armor creates manufacturing challenges German factories aren't equipped to handle. Welding thick plates at severe angles requires specialized jigs and techniques Soviet factories developed through years of production experience. German armor plate production emphasizes face-hardened steel, which offers superior protection but is more difficult to weld at complex angles than the rolled homogeneous armor the Soviets use. Most critically, copying the 34 would require admitting that Soviet engineering surpassed German design philosophy. This admission carries political implications that make it unacceptable to Nazi leadership. The regime's entire propaganda apparatus rests on assertions of Aryan technological superiority, acknowledging that Slavs, whom Nazi ideology describes as racially inferior, designed a tank better than anything German engineers produced, would undermine core ideological premises. Instead, the Weapons Office directs Daimler-Benz and MAN to develop a new medium tank incorporating 34 design principles while maintaining German engineering standards. The specifications call for a 30-ton vehicle mounting sloped armor, a long-barreled gun, and improved cross-country mobility. Both companies submit proposals by spring 1942. Daimler-Benz designs the VK 30.02D, which resembles the 34 so closely it could be mistaken for a German copy. MAN submits the VK 30.02M, which incorporates sloped armor and a powerful gun while retaining more conventional German layout and design features. Hitler personally reviews both proposals and selects Daimler-Benz's design, precisely because it so obviously incorporates Soviet principles. But the Weapons Office overrules him, choosing MAN's proposal because it can be manufactured using existing German production facilities and tooling. The MAN design becomes the Panzer V Panther, arguably Germany's best tank of World War II, but one that won't enter service until July 1943, 20 months after the Panzer Commission identified the need. The delay costs lives. Throughout 1942, German tank crews continue facing 34s with weapons that struggle to penetrate Soviet armor reliably. The Panzer III receives upgraded 50mm guns with longer barrels and higher muzzle velocities. These weapons can penetrate 34 armor at ranges under 500 meters if striking perpendicular to the surface, but angled hits still frequently ricochet. The Panzer IV gets rearmed with the long-barreled 75mm KOK-40 gun, which finally provides reliable penetration against 34 frontal armor at combat ranges. But converting Panzer IV production to the new gun configuration takes time, and older models remain in frontline service throughout 1942. German anti-tank doctrine evolves to compensate for technological disadvantage. The Park 38 50mm gun, previously considered adequate for medium tank engagement, gets supplemented with the Park 40 75mm gun. This weapon, firing armor-piercing rounds at higher velocities than the Panzer IV's tank gun, can penetrate 34 armor frontally at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. But the Pak-40 weighs significantly, more than earlier anti-tank guns, requiring heavy trucks or half-tracks to move it, and it cannot be manhandled into position by its crew like the lighter Pak-36. The most effective German weapon against 34s remains the 88mm Flak gun pressed into anti-tank service. The Flak 18 and 36, designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers, fire projectiles with muzzle velocities and kinetic energy that defeat any armor the Soviets field. At ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, 88mm guns can penetrate 34 armor regardless of impact angle. But these weapons are scarce, heavy, vulnerable when deployed, and desperately needed for their primary role of air defense. The physics behind sloped armor's effectiveness is brutally simple. When a projectile strikes armor perpendicular to the surface, all its kinetic energy focuses on penetrating the steel directly in front of it. The shell's penetrator, typically hardened steel or tungsten carbide, must displace a cylinder of armor whose diameter equals the penetrator's diameter and whose depth equals the plate's thickness. This requires specific kinetic energy levels measured in joules per square millimeter of penetrator cross-section. But angle the armor even modestly, and the physics change. A projectile striking a plate at 30 degrees from perpendicular must travel through more steel to reach the interior. The effective thickness increases by the secant of the angle. 30 degrees increases effective thickness by 15%. 60 degrees doubles it. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees provides protection equivalent to 90mm of vertical armor against projectiles traveling horizontally. The angle creates additional effects beyond increased thickness. Projectiles striking sloped armor tend to deflect rather than penetrate. The impact angle, combined with the hardness differential between the penetrator and the armor and plate, creates forces that can shatter the projectile or cause it to skip off the surface. Armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate vertical plates often perform poorly against sloped armor because their hardened penetrators, optimized for direct impact, become brittle when striking at angles. The 34's designers understood these principles and optimized every surface likely to face enemy fire. The glacis, most frequently targeted in frontal engagements, slopes at 60 degrees, the turret face angles at 30 degrees. Even the lower hull sides incorporate 40-degree slopes. The only vertical surfaces are the rear hull plate, the lower side armor below the sponsons, and the turret sides, all less likely to face enemy fire during combat. German tanks in 1941 used predominantly vertical armor because manufacturing is simpler, internal space is maximized, and German doctrine assumes superior gunnery and tactics will win engagements before armor becomes decisive. This philosophy worked against opponents using similar design principles. Against 34s, it proves fatally flawed. The Wehrmacht eventually adapts. The Panther, entering service in summer 1943, incorporates sloped glacis armor at 55 degrees, protecting 80mm of plate. The Tiger II heavy tank, deployed in early 1944, uses sloped armor throughout. Post-war German armor, after the Bundeswehr's formation in the 1950s, universally adopts sloped armor design. The American M48 Patton, the British Centurion, the French AMX-30, and virtually every subsequent main battle tank incorporates armor angles learned from 34 encounters. But in October 1941, standing in the wreckage of 4th Panzer Division's positions near Mzensk, German officers understand only that they're fighting an enemy whose medium tank outmatches their own. The technological superiority they assumed would carry them to Moscow is gone. In its place is the realization that Soviet engineers, working under Stalin's brutal regime, designed a weapon that challenges everything German armor doctrine held true. The immediate tactical consequences of 34 sloped armor superiority ripple through Wehrmacht operations during the crucial winter of 1941–42. As German forces stall before Moscow, as the Soviet counteroffensive throws back exhausted panzer divisions, the technological revelation at Mzensk contributes to a broader erosion of German confidence. The invincible Wehrmacht that conquered Europe in 2 years discovers that victory is not inevitable, that their equipment is not supreme, and that assumptions about enemy inferiority were dangerously wrong. German tank losses during 1941 exceed production. The Wehrmacht begins Operation Barbarossa with approximately 3,800 tanks. By December 1941, they've lost approximately 2,700 tanks destroyed and another 1,400 damaged beyond field repair. Replacements from German factories total only around 700 new vehicles. The mathematics are brutal. The Panzer force is consuming itself faster than industry can replenish losses. Soviet tank losses are catastrophically higher in absolute numbers. The Red Army loses approximately 20,500 tanks during 1941, a staggering hemorrhage that would cripple any other nation's armored forces. But Soviet production, evacuated to factories beyond the Urals and operating under wartime emergency conditions, manufactures approximately 6,300 tanks during the same period, including approximately 3,034s. The Soviet Union can absorb losses that would destroy Germany's war-making capacity because Soviet industrial mobilization, crude and inefficient by Western standards, nevertheless produces vast quantities of adequate equipment. The 34's design philosophy prioritizes production efficiency over crew comfort or mechanical refinement. Soviet factories can manufacture 34 hulls using relatively unskilled labor because the sloped armor design minimizes complex curves and tight tolerances. Armor plates are cut to size, beveled to the correct angles, and welded together using techniques that prioritize speed over aesthetic perfection. The welds are often rough, sometimes showing gaps filled with additional passes, but they're structurally sound. The result is armor protection that works rather than armor protection that looks impressive in manufacturing inspections. The diesel engine, while offering battlefield advantages in range and fire resistance, also simplifies production logistics. The V-234 uses fewer precision-machined components than comparable gasoline engines. Its fuel injection system, though crude, functions reliably without the complex carburation German gasoline engines require. Soviet factories can produce these engines using machine tools evacuated from European Russia to Siberian and Ural industrial centers, maintaining production despite catastrophic territorial losses. This production efficiency creates strategic advantages that compound the 34's tactical superiority. By 1942, Soviet factories are producing 34s faster than the Wehrmacht can destroy them. The Red Army loses 6,600 34s during 1942, but production delivers 12,500 new tanks during the same year. The numerical advantage, combined with improving Soviet tactical proficiency as surviving crews gain experience, gradually shifts the armor balance on the Eastern Front. The German response, constrained by industrial capacity and ideological resistance to copying Soviet designs, focuses on upgunning existing tanks and accelerating Panther development. But the Panther program encounters difficulties that delay deployment. Early prototypes suffer mechanical failures. The engine and transmission, overstressed by the Panther's 45-ton weight, prove unreliable. The interleaved road wheel design, elegant in theory, clogs with mud and freezes in winter conditions, immobilizing tanks that should be operationally ready. When Panthers finally enter combat at Kursk in July 1943, they perform impressively against Soviet armor when functioning correctly, but mechanical failures sideline more Panthers than enemy fire destroys. The 75mm KOK-42 gun can penetrate 34 armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, and the Panther's sloped frontal armor defeats most Soviet anti-tank weapons. But reliability problems mean that Panther battalions often report only 30 to 40% of their nominal strength as combat-ready. The irony is profound. German engineers, assigned to incorporate 34 design principles into a German medium tank, created a vehicle that captured the Soviet tank's armor and firepower advantages while ignoring the reliability and production efficiency that made the 34 strategically decisive. The Panther is arguably the better tank in technical specifications, but the 34 is the better weapon in the only metric that matters in total war. Can you produce enough of them? maintain them in field conditions, and crew them with available personnel. The 34's influence extends far beyond the Eastern Front. American and British observers, studying captured examples, recognize immediately that sloped armor represents the future of tank design. U.S. Army Ordnance evaluates a 34 shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland during 1942. American engineers measure the armor angles, test the ballistic protection, examine the suspension, and incorporate lessons learned into American tank development. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, entering service in early 1945, uses sloped glacis armor at 46 degrees, directly influenced by 34 analysis. The M46 Patton, America's first post-war main battle tank, incorporates comprehensive sloped armor throughout. Every subsequent American tank design, from the M48 through the M60 to the modern Monet Abrams, uses sloped armor as a fundamental design principle established by Soviet engineers at Kharkov in 1939. British tank design, historically conservative and prioritizing crew survivability over armor optimization, shifts towards sloped armor in post-war development. The Centurion, Britain's most successful tank design, uses modest armor slopes on its initial variants but increases angles in later marks. The Chieftain and Challenger series adopt comprehensive sloped armor layouts. French armor development, resuming after liberation, immediately incorporates sloped armor in the AMX series tanks. Even neutral Sweden, whose Stridsvagn tank series maintained independence from either NATO or Warsaw Pact design influence, adopted sloped armor principles after evaluating World War II armor development. The S-tank, Sweden's innovative turretless design from the 1960s, takes sloped armor to its logical extreme, with a hull glacis angled at 78 degrees, providing extraordinary protection from minimal armor thickness. The Soviet Union continues developing the 34 throughout the war. The 34-85, entering service in early 1944, mounts an 85mm gun capable of defeating German heavy tank armor at combat ranges. The turret is enlarged to accommodate a three-man crew, addressing the original design's greatest tactical weakness. These improvements maintain the 34's competitiveness through the war's end, though by 1945 it faces German armor incorporating the same sloped armor principles that made it formidable in 1941. Production statistics tell the story of the 34's strategic impact. Between 1940 and 1945, Soviet factories manufacture approximately 57,700 34s in all variants. This represents the largest production run of any tank in history, exceeding even the American M4 Sherman's 49,324 units. The 34's combination of adequate performance, simple construction, and production efficiency makes it the ideal weapon for the Soviet Union's manpower and industrial advantages. Post-war service extends the 34's operational life for decades. The Soviet Union exports thousands of surplus 34s to allied nations and client states. North Korea's invasion of South Korea in June 1950 employs approximately 240 34-85s that proved devastatingly effective against American and South Korean forces initially. Equipped only with light anti-tank weapons, the shock of encountering 34s in Korea, nearly a decade after World War II ended, prompts urgent American rearmament programs and accelerates M48 Patton deployment. 34s serve in Middle Eastern conflicts through the 1960s and 70s. Syrian and Egyptian forces operate 34s during the Suez Crisis of 1956, the Six-Day War of 1967, and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Israeli forces capture dozens of Arab 34s and press some into Israeli service, occasionally fighting against newer Soviet-supplied tanks in the bizarre circumstance of obsolete Soviet weapons opposing modern Soviet weapons. African and Asian conflicts employ 34s through the 1980s. Angola, Mozambique, Cambodia, and Vietnam all field 34s in various civil wars and regional conflicts. The tank's mechanical simplicity and robust in construction make it suitable for service in harsh environments with limited maintenance infrastructure. Some 34s remain in active military service in the 21st century, 8 decades after their introduction, a testament to design fundamentals that remain valid even as technology advances beyond recognition. But the 34's true legacy isn't measured in production numbers or decades of service. Its legacy is the principle it established, that armor angle matters as much as armor thickness, that geometric optimization can multiply protection without increasing weight, and that revolutionary thinking can overcome resource disadvantages. Koshkin's decision to prioritize sloped armor despite the internal space penalties it created established a design principle that governs modern tank development. The German tank crews who first encountered 34s near the Dwina River in June 1941, who watched their best shots ricochet off angled steel, who felt the psychological impact of confronting armor they couldn't penetrate, experienced the collision between doctrine and reality. Their reports, filed in field conditions using carbon paper and poor lighting, captured a moment when technological assumptions shattered against physical evidence. The word impossible appears repeatedly in German combat reports from mid-1941. Impossible that Soviet industry could produce such capable tanks. Impossible that shells fired at point-blank range could fail to penetrate. Impossible that the Red Army, supposedly primitive and disorganized, fielded armor superior to anything the Wehrmacht operated. Each instance of impossible represented a German soldier's understanding that his training, his doctrine, and his equipment were inadequate for the battle he faced. But impossible things happen when engineers ignore conventional wisdom and pursue optimization based on physics rather than tradition. Koshkin's 34 succeeded because it optimized the relationship between armor angle and effective protection in ways Western designers dismissed as impractical. The cramped crew compartment, the difficult ergonomics, the rough construction were acceptable trade-offs for armor that kept crews alive during combat. Dead tankers in comfortable tanks accomplish nothing. Living tankers in cramped tanks win battles. The psychological impact of encountering invulnerable armor extends beyond tactical considerations. Soldiers fight effectively when they believe their weapons work, when they trust that training and doctrine provide effective responses to threats. German tank crews in Poland and France fought with the confidence that their Panzer IIIs and IVs could defeat any enemy armor they encountered. This confidence enabled aggressive tactics and rapid advances. Against 34s, that confidence eroded. Crews began approaching encounters with Soviet armor defensively, seeking positional advantages that might enable flank shots rather than engaging frontally with confidence in their weapons. This psychological shift contributed to operational caution that slowed German advances during critical phases of the Moscow offensive. Commanders who might have pushed forward aggressively instead consolidated positions and waited for artillery or air support. The time cost of this caution, measured in days and weeks during late 1941, allowed Soviet forces to establish defenses that ultimately halted the German drive on Moscow. The story of the 34's sloped armor reveals a broader truth about technological development during wartime. Superior design doesn't emerge from superior resources or superior industrial capacity. It emerges from correctly identifying which variables matter most and optimizing those variables regardless of convention. Soviet engineers, working under Stalin's brutal regime with limited resources and constant political pressure, created the war's most influential tank by prioritizing armor effectiveness over crew comfort, production efficiency over manufacturing perfection, and functional adequacy over technological elegance. German soldiers never stopped being excellent fighters. Their training, discipline, and tactical proficiency remained high throughout the war. But they spent years fighting with equipment that was adequate against obsolete opponents and inadequate against modern designs. The 34's sloped armor didn't win the Eastern Front alone. Soviet manpower, American materiel aid, German strategic overextension, and Hitler's catastrophic decision-making all contributed to German defeat. But the 34 ensured that German tactical excellence couldn't compensate for strategic failures, that numerical superiority in personnel couldn't offset technical inferiority in equipment, When Lieutenant Schäufler watched his 75mm shell ricochet off that 34 near Mzensk in October 1941, he witnessed the moment when German assumptions about technological superiority collapsed. The shell's trajectory, arcing skyward after striking sloped armor at an angle that transformed 45mm of steel into 90mm of effective protection, traced the arc of German confidence in reverse. What went up inevitably came down. What seemed impossible became undeniable reality. The 34's legacy persists in every modern main battle tank rolling off assembly lines today. The Monet Abrams uses sloped composite armor. The German Leopard 2 uses sloped steel. The British Challenger uses sloped ceramics. The principle Koshkin established 85 years ago, that armor angle multiplies protection more efficiently than armor thickness alone, remains fundamental to modern tank design. Every tanker who survives combat because angled armor deflected a round that might have penetrated vertical plate owes their survival, at least in part, to the principle established on that 34 production line in Kharkov. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.